Today we're sewing another beautiful pattern that I can't believe is free. This is the Romy Lantern Sleeve Blouse by Tiana's Closet. I made a couple changes to the construction as I was making the blouse. I ended up omitting both the neckline binding and the back slit binding. And instead for the neckline, I used my own single fold bias tape. And for the back slit, I created a facing using the main fabric. I'll share the dimensions for the back facing within the sew along. The style of this blouse is very unique. You're going to get tons of compliments. I hope you join me in sewing it. Let's get started. I've transferred the bust markings from my pattern piece onto the wrong side of my front bodice piece. Now I'm going to pin them in place, folding each dart in half and pinning through one dart leg and out the other. Doing this for both darts. And then sew each dart in place from the outside edge to the point, leaving thread tails at the point so you can tie them in knots. And then press those darts down toward the bottom of the bodice. Then we can place our front and back bodice pieces right sides together and pin the shoulder seams and the side seams. Sew both shoulder seams and both side seams with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and finish your raw edges. Place your upper sleeve and lower sleeve right sides together and pin the bottom curved edge. Sew this seam with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, finish the raw edges, and repeat for both upper and lower sleeve sets. Now that the upper and lower sleeve pieces are attached and the seam is finished, and that seam allowance is pressed up toward the upper sleeve, we're going to top stitch the seam allowance to the bottom of the upper sleeve, sewing from the right side of the garment just above the original stitching line, from one side of the sleeve all the way across to the other, again doing this for both sleeves. Then we can take the bottom of the lower sleeve to the sewing machine and using the longest stitch on your machine, sew basting stitches from one side to the other. I'm going to start and stop my stitches a 1/2 inch away from both sides so that I don't catch those basting stitches when I sew the underarm seam. And I'm going to use about a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Do this for the bottoms of both sleeves. And make sure you leave thread tails on both ends so that you have threads to pull for gathering. Now we'll fold the sleeve right sides together with itself and pin the underarm seam for both sleeves. Sew both seams with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and finish the raw edges. Fold your cuff pieces right sides together, matching the short edges, and pin in place. Sew both seams with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and press the seams open. Then we'll fold each of the sleeve cuffs in half, wrong sides together, and give the folded edges a good press. Now I'm going to open the cuff back out and press each of the raw edges to the wrong side by 1/2 inch, all the way around for both edges. Then I can refold it in half along the original crease line. So now the raw edges are tucked to the inside of the cuff. Do this for both cuffs. Now I'm going to start attaching the cuff to the bottom of the sleeve, matching the seam of the cuff with the seam at the bottom of the sleeve. I'm going to insert the bottom of the sleeve in between the fold of the cuff by about 1/2 inch and pin in place. Then I'll pull my basting stitches so that the bottom of the sleeve fits the bottom of the cuff, and then continue inserting that seam allowance in between the fold of the cuff and pinning all the way around. Now I have the bottom of the sleeve fully encased between the folded edges of the cuff. And I'm going to take it to my sewing machine and edge stitch close to those folded edges all the way around that inner fold of the cuff and repeat for both sleeves. To create a back neck facing, I cut a rectangle from my main fabric measuring 3 by 5 inches, as well as a piece of inner facing measuring 2 by 4.5 inches. Fuse the inner facing in place, aligning the top edge and centering the rest of the inner facing in place. And then I'll press the raw edges to the wrong side, right along the edge of the inner facing along the bottom and side edges. Now I'll mark a vertical line right down the center of the facing, stopping my line about 1/2 inch above the end of the interfacing. Now I'll place my facing and the top of the back neckline right sides together, aligning the top raw edge, matching the center and pin in place. And I'll continue pinning down the line to attach the 2 layers together. Now I'll take it to my sewing machine and sew along the line about 1/8 inch away from the line on both sides, curving my stitching around the bottom of my marked line. Now I'll use scissors to slash down my marked line, to but not through the stitching line. And around the bottom curved edge, make a series of small snips to but not through the stitching. Then we'll understitch both sides of the facing. Fold the facing over its seam allowance, and we're going to sew the facing to its seam allowance from the top to as far as we can get to the bottom of the slit, and repeat for both sides. Now that that's understitched, we can turn the facing to the inside of the garment and give it a good press. Now that that's pressed with the seam allowances from earlier still pressed under, we're going to edge stitch along those side and bottom edges, pivoting at the bottom corners. Now with my sleeve right side out and my bodice inside out, place the corresponding sleeve into the armscye so the pieces are right sides together and pin in place starting at the underarm seam. Then I'll match the notches that indicate front and back and continue pinning in place all the way around. Sew the sleeve to the bodice with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, finish the raw edges, and repeat for both sleeves. To bind the neckline, I'm going to use 1/2 inch single fold bias tape. I'm going to open out one end of the bias tape and fold the short end back by about 1/4 inch. Then I'll align that folded edge with the slit opening in the back, also aligning the open raw edge of the bias tape with the raw edge of the neckline, and start pinning in place. Then I'll allow that loose end of the bias tape to extend the back slit on the opposite side by 1/4 inch, so I can fold that short end under and pin in place. Now I'm going to stitch around the entire neckline with about 1/4 inch seam allowance, stitching right in line with the crease from my bias tape. Now I'll turn my binding to the inside of the garment right along my stitching line so that you can't see the binding from the outside of the garment, and I'll pin in place with the opposite side of the binding still pressed under. Now for the button loop, I'm going to use a small piece of cording. Mine is 2.5 inches long, and I'll fold it in half, and I'll insert it between the binding and the main fabric on one side of the slit, just tucking those raw edges underneath. And I'll pin that in place. Now from one side of the slit all the way around to the opposite side, I'm going to edge stitch close to that inner fold of the bias tape. Also edge stitching vertically along both ends, mainly to secure this button loop. Then you can sew on a button opposite your button loop. The hem allowance for the bottom of the garment is 1 inch. I'm going to take it to the ironing board and press the raw edge to the wrong side twice. First by 1/2 inch, then roll that on top of itself to press again by an additional 1/2 inch, doing this all the way around. Now that my hem is pressed in place, I'll take it to the sewing machine and edge stitch close to that inner fold all the way around. Give everything a final press and your blouse is complete. Thank you for watching this sew along. Make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss notifications for when another full-length sewing tutorial comes out. I'll see you in the next video.